Well, my family always complain that my voice is too loud, so perhaps this is the moment when it's not so much of a disadvantage. Nigel Farage always says, incidentally, what I'm a member of the UK Independence Party, and I'm proud to have been elected as a member of the European Parliament for the UK Independence Party, but when in the Parliament, we sit in a group in order to be more effective, which is called EFD, or Europe for Freedom and Democracy. And if anybody wants to ask any questions about that, I'd be delighted to answer a little bit later on. Nigel Farage always says you should only hold public meetings when the weather is sufficiently good that people are playing cricket. And I think, so I must particularly thank you for coming out tonight on what's a terrible night. My normal walk on the cliff from the Miramar Hotel proved to be completely impossible. But we did feel that what we're being discussed is sufficiently important that it couldn't really wait until the cricket season began. And I'm delighted that, however, that the meeting is being filmed. In fact, there seem to be 3 film cameras here, which I'm very impressed by. And some of that will be both on YouTube and UKIP TV, as well as my own website, which is www.williamdartmouth.com. Now, I'm going to talk this evening, about the European Arrest Warrant. I shall say something about avocatado, more briefly. I shall talk even more briefly about the US-UK extradition. And then I shall talk about the European Court of Human Rights. Now, Mark Turner is going to talk after me to say what it's like for a family to get involved, to get in the extrications of the European Arrest Warrant. But I'm going to give a little bit more of an overview. The European Arrest Warrant came in 2003, and what was typical of what was said at the time was that Bob Ainsworth, who later on became a supremely distinguished Minister of Defence, said, "This bill is a much-needed reform of our outdated and antiquated extradition laws. It is the interest of us all that criminals are not able to string out extradition proceedings for years on end. The old maxim, justice delayed is justice denied, applies in extradition as it applies in other fields of criminal justice. This bill will finally enable us to have an extradition system that is capable of coping with the world of free movement of cheap travel." Now, when that bill came in, many lawyers said it was a very bad idea, but all the establishment parties voted in favour of it. Only the UK Independence Party voted against. Now, Mark is going to say a little bit about what it's like and an account of what happened. But there are 3 things that came across to me. One is that Mark Turner's son, Michael Turner, was surrendered to Hungarian police on British soil. The second thing that I'd note is that it was, when they were taken to prison in Hungary, it was 3 weeks in prison before they were allowed to contact their families. And the other thing is that Mr. Ainsworth talked about justice delayed is justice denied. Now, the fact of the matter is that the fact of the matter is that the allegations made against Mr. Turner and Mr. McGoldrick related to events that happened between 2003 and 2005. The final verdict of a suspended sentence, and incidentally no criminal record, only took place on November the 29th, 2012, virtually 7 years later, more than 7 years later. The fact of the matter is that because of the European Arrest Warrant, we are consigning British citizens and residents to harsh legal systems. Now, Michael Turner and Jason McGoldrick were actually held in a high-security remand prison in Budapest, which I visited in February 2010. Now, remand prisoners tend to be in worse conditions than permanent prisoners, because the imprisonment is meant to be temporary. Now, at that prison, the prisoners were only allowed 1 hour of exercise a day. They were only allowed out of the cell 1 hour out of every 24 hours. They only got a shower once a week. They were only allowed to make a telephone call once a week. And that brings me to the more general point. In the Anglo-American world of justice, in the world that we're used to, the world of Magna Carta, habeus corpus, and so on, the primary purpose of the law is not to lock people up. The primary purpose of the law is to protect people from random arrest and arbitrary imprisonment by the state. That is the law for us as we've understood it. And that's what you learn at school. Magna Carta, habeus corpus, trial by jury, and the rest. Now, in continental Europe, the system is entirely different. In continental Europe, they have an investigative system, which means that if the authorities, or even just a prosecutor, suspect somebody of something, they simply imprison them while they gather evidence, or while they gather evidence. Now, when I went to Hungary for the first time back in February 2010, because of the little bit of status that I have as an MEP, which derives entirely from you, the Hungarian authorities treated me with exemplary courtesy, which is hardly the point. I met with the Ministry of Justice, I visited the prison in Budapest, and I met with the prosecutor in his office. And I said to the prosecutor, my two constituents, our two constituents, Michael Turner and Jason McCordrick, have already been in prison for over 100 days. When do you anticipate that there will be a trial date? And when I asked that question, the Prime Minister was very courteous. We were sipping coffee in his office, and he said, there is no trial date. And then I asked, my next question is, which was this: how long can they, under Hungarian law, how long can they be in prison on remand before there has to be a trial? And he said, up to 4 years. And in case anyone is interested in the detail, it's 3 years, extendable to 4. Now, Michael and Jason were there for, as it happens, were subsequently released. But they'd been there for 115 days. But under the law, they could have been there for about 4 years, which is almost 1,400 days. And if it hadn't been for Fair Trials International, if it hadn't been for, dare I say, the BBC, and also, if I can dare say something, if it hadn't been for myself and others, there is absolutely no question they would have still been in that prison until the trial took place, until the final verdict took place, which was only on November the 29th. And why we're holding this meeting in the winter, which you should never hold political meetings in the winter, is because this matter is too important to be left to that time. We need to tell people about it. Now, the fact that, and it is an absolute disgrace that the establishment politicians, particularly in the House of Lords, of which I was once a member, keep peddling the myth that the legal system is the same as ours in the other European countries, and of course that's absolutely untrue. Now, sadly, the case of Michael and Jason is not the only case. There are other cases. Let's look at the case of Andrew Symeou for about a minute. There's an article in the Times from June the 22nd, and I quote, Andrew Symeou is a British student. This is the actual article from the Times newspaper. He was 18, was whisked off to Greece under a European arrest warrant because he was accused of being involved in a fight in a nightclub, even though, according to eyewitnesses, he was not present. The Greek police beat identical statements out of the witnesses that were all later withdrawn. Mr. Symeou spent almost a year in appalling conditions in a prison near Athens before being bailed. He was whipped, he was abused by the guards, and witnessed another prisoner being beaten to death. Now, after this article was printed, the Greeks dropped the charges and let Mr. Symeou go, and said, to be fair, that they were wrong. It was a case of mistaken identity. But the scary thing is that mistaken identity can happen to almost anybody. Now, let me now talk about Abu Qatada, who's recently been in the news. Abu Qatada came to Britain on a forged passport in 1993 from Afghanistan. Abu Qatada then claimed and was granted asylum. It is completely mysterious why he's never been prosecuted for holding a forged passport. Now, Mr. Qatada is wanted for terrorist offences in 6 different countries. Now, over the last 10 years, from 2002, 6 Home Secretaries in 2 different governments have tried and failed to deport Abu Qatada in order to get this man out of our country, where he is perceived by the judiciary as being a danger to us all. Now, in that 10 years, Abu Qatada's family, which incidentally is his wife and 5 children, has had free housing paid for by the British taxpayer, and they've just demanded to go to another house. They've had their legal fees. He's had his legal fees, which has been estimated at £3 million, paid for by the British taxpayer. And perhaps Mark, without being intrusive, might say something about the legal fees that he's had to pay out. And the future costs of his surveillance are estimated at an incredible £5 million a year, all at the cost of the British taxpayer, or to use an old-fashioned term, the public purse. Now, Theresa May is appealing to the Court of Appeal, has announced she's appealing to the Court of Appeal, the Home Secretary, but there is no appeal date. And frankly, Theresa May's appeal is likely simply to result in yet another bonanza payday at our expense for Abu Qatada's human rights lawyers. Now, you may have seen the controversy about Mr. Christopher Tappin, which is another sad thing which has come across, which has come out because of the one-sided US-UK extradition treaty, which incidentally the UK Independence Party is also opposed to. Now, I'm going to read, it's very short, this is half a minute, from a newspaper that is not normally very prose, which is the Financial Times. And this is what he said. Christopher Tappin, a retired businessman, has been extradited to the US, triggering fresh controversy over Britain's extradition laws and the UK's continued inability to deport radical Islamist preacher Abu Qatada. As he arrived at Heathrow with his wife, Mr. Tappin claimed he had fewer rights than a suspected terrorist, and said it was a disgrace that Mr. Qatada was being allowed to remain in the UK, while he, Mr. Tappin, was sent to the US. The 65-year-old was put on an aircraft bound for Texas, handcuffed and seated between 2 US marshals. Earlier, he said to the BBC, "I have no rights. Abu Qatada is walking the streets of London today, and we cannot extradite him. He has more rights than I have." Mr. Tappin added, "If I was a terrorist, I would not be going to America." So there you have it. This mess, this legal contradiction, this disastrous impossibility, which none of us can even imagine. I'm amazed I'm even being able to say it. How has this come about? It's come about because of the European Court of Human Rights. Let's very briefly have a look at this court. On the European Court of Human Rights, there are represented judges from 46 countries. These countries include the minnows. It's a bit like being on a quiz on Mastermind. There's Andorra, there's Liechtenstein, there's Monaco, and there's even San Marino. But there's other countries on the courts too. Countries which have no human rights record or a disgraceful human rights record. For example, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Putin's Russia, Serbia, Turkey, where they lock up journalists, and Ukraine, where the former Prime Minister, Mrs. Tymoshenko, and leader of the opposition, was put in jail, was in prison, is serving a 7-year prison service on what appear to be trumped-up charges. These are the countries who are telling us, these are the countries who are telling us here in England what is or what is not human rights. The other point is, there's a very serious question mark about the qualifications of these people. 7 out of the 11 people sitting at the European Court of Human Rights have never been judges. And if we see who the judges were of the Qatada decision, there were 7 judges, one of them from Bosnia-Herzegovina, one of them from Albania, and one of them from Moldova. But the president, but also sitting on the court, was the former head of the court, who's actually British of Serbian descent, called Sir Nicholas Braxa. Well, various people have looked into the record of Sir Nicholas Braxa, and all that Sir Nicholas Braxa achieved when he was in the legal profession in the UK was that he was what's called a recorder, which is the most junior form of part-time judge. And there is no way with someone with that mediocre record of legal achievement could become head of the Court of Appeals in Britain. But these are the sort and quality of people who come to the top of the European institutions. And incidentally, Baroness Ashton is another one. So in short, the European Court of Human Rights is a Mickey Mouse court with Donald Duck judges that consistently comes up with perverse and reckless judgments that potentially danger us all. Let me compare Abu Qatada to the European Arrest Warrant and how our own citizens have been treated. When the European Arrest Warrant is issued and is considered by a British court, the judge, the British judge, no longer has the right to go through the primary evidence. People in England have tried to appeal against the European Arrest Warrant. Our people have tried to appeal against the European Arrest Warrant on the grounds of their human rights, but none of these have yet been allowed. Application for extradition being evaluated by our British judges is gone. It's just a box-ticking exercise. The British judge no longer has the power to stop people getting carted off to these harsh jurisdictions in the European Union. Now, Michael Turner comes from Corfe Castle, and Mark runs the Castle Inn in Corfe Castle. And you're probably familiar with the term, an Englishman's home is his castle. Well, I'm afraid that's no more. England has signed the European Arrest Warrant, and Britain is subject to the European Court of Human Rights. The judgments of this European Court has perverse consequences. And if you cut through the jargon, this is the consequence. It means that, for example, a convicted Jordanian, which is what Abu Qatada is, or a convicted Somali, or Algerian, or anyone who comes from a number of approximately 25 other countries, whatever he or she has done, murder, terrorism, human trafficking, he or she cannot be deported, even if the foreign criminal remaining here is a danger to us all. By contrast, a British citizen or resident who is accused, it's all that needs to be, an accusation of a very minor crime in a member state of the European Union on no evidence, on false evidence, on insubstantial evidence, or on evidence that wouldn't begin to stand up in court. Our laws, our judges, our police cannot protect him or her. Indeed, they don't even begin to try. That is what happened to Michael Turner and Jason McGoldrick, and that is the perverse consequence of bowing down to these alien legal systems and writing them into British law. To restate, our own people can be carted off to prisons in former Eastern Bloc countries, or for that matter the United States. But at the same time, we as a country cannot now easily deport hardened criminals to the countries which they came from, and in some cases, not at all. This is the legal mess, the dangerous impossibility that the establishment politicians have gotten us into. The European Arrest Warrant, the European Investigation Order, the European Court of Human Rights, taken together, place at risk the long-standing and hard-won liberties that we in Britain have been able to take up to now for granted. And that's why I call this evening, to sum up and to finish, that's why I call this evening and call now for an immediate suspension of the European Arrest Warrant preparatory to withdrawal, and that we abandon forthwith the European Convention on Human Rights so that we are no longer subject to this Mickey Mouse court. And its ugly offspring, the European Court of Human Rights. The country of Magna Carta does not need to take lessons or listen to judgments on human rights from Turkey, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Putin's Russia. Thank you very much.
I'll do my best to project my voice. Obviously, used to working in a bar, people are normally a lot closer. It was a nice, warm, sunny day in Lanzarote in November 2008. We'd been around the local pub, hadn't had a holiday for 5 years, and taken what was then our youngster, must have been about 7, taken him away for a couple of weeks in the sunshine. It had been a nice sunny day. We sat down to a lovely meal in a restaurant overlooking the ocean, and the phone rang. And my older son, Michael, in a very worried voice, said, "I am subject to a European arrest warrant, and I'm being searched for by a group called SOCO, the Serious and Organised Crime Agency." I was shocked to hear that. I told him, I said, "You better get a solicitor quickly, and I'll come back and do all I can to assist." Well, that was the first surprise he had, because he tried to find a solicitor locally, and when I say locally from Corfe Castle, I mean the Isle of Purbeck, Poole, Bournemouth, Southampton, over quite a wide area, and not one solicitor was prepared to help or assist in any way. It would have been easier, I think, to have said, "I've got AIDS, herpes, every sort of awful disease you could think of," and say, "Would you like to share my toothbrush?" I'm sure that would have got a more positive response. So I arrived back in the United Kingdom. That was the end of our chance to get a holiday, and we tried to find a solicitor. In the meantime, I phoned the local police station, explained what the situation was, and Michael agreed if there was a warrant against him of any kind, he would be coming straight forward to speak up for himself. He had nothing to hide, and supported law and order, and would report straight to the local police station. They said, "Oh, it's nothing to do with us, there's nothing we can do. This is a matter for SOCO, the Serious and Organised Crime Agency." So I wondered who these people were, so I went and looked on their website, and it says, there we go, SOCO, Serious and Organised Crime Agency, tackling serious organised crime, including Class A drugs, people smuggling, human trafficking, money laundering, and major gun crime. So we as yet hadn't seen this arrest warrant or what it contained, but we made arrangements to go along to Westminster Magistrates Court, because the other thing is the only place you can report to if you're subject to a European arrest warrant is Westminster Magistrates Court, and that doesn't matter where you live. So even if you're living in a remote part of Wales or up in Sunderland or wherever, all these cases are heard in London, which must make, certainly for people if they're on a low income, travelling backwards and forwards and arriving on time very difficult indeed. But off we went to Westminster Magistrates Court to meet this group called SOCO. And the police officer concerned was very thoughtful, very considerate, and was somewhat annoyed at having to be involved in this process at all. And he said, "We're going to appear before a magistrate, so what we're going to do is I'm going to have to arrest you." That doesn't mean there was any handcuffs or any particular criminal type procedure. It was a case of explaining his rights to him. He very carefully said, look, this is what's going to happen now. You're going to be under caution, so you have to be careful what you say. You have the right to speak to a lawyer, not to answer questions if you don't want to, and so forth. And the agent from SOCO explained to us how really they'd be better off if they could have the time to pursue these criminals that they were supposed to be pursuing. And we heard cases mentioned like where they had to go and attempt to arrest a man who was wanted in Poland for stealing a chicken. One man had been requested for a European arrest warrant because on leaving a party it was alleged he took the wrong jacket, having had too much to drink. And there was our serious and organised crime agency putting effort into hundreds of these types of petty cases every year. We appeared at Westminster Magistrates. Never was my son in prison or in handcuffs or anything of that nature. He made himself available to the authorities, and we opposed his going to Hungary. Because in Hungary, it appeared on the warrant, he was wanted for a case of fraud. But a little investigation of the Hungarian system, which our politicians had agreed is on a par to ours, showed that as yet they hadn't even had an investigation, never mind a preparation or him being wanted for trial. We're up and down to Westminster Magistrates Court for probably almost a year, going backwards and forwards to meetings at the whim of the court, sometimes to appear for more than 5 minutes just to renew a bail application. And eventually the Westminster Magistrates Court said, no, you have to go. It's a rubber stamping exercise. We don't like to call it extradition anymore. We call it a matter of surrender, because you're staying within the same legal jurisdiction, the same as going from Wiltshire to Hampshire, Hampshire to Dorset, or whatever. So we thought, well, obviously, no doubt when we get there, we'll be given the same courtesy as we would in England. So we appealed that case anyway and went along to the High Court in the Strand. And that was quite distressing then, as you realised you were on your own. Nobody seemed to care. We tried to talk to politicians. They just said, no, there's nothing we can do. We can't interfere. It's a judicial matter. In the High Court in the Strand, Michael was fortunate enough to have a good human rights barrister. And he explained to the judge that Michael was seeking protection from arbitrary arrest and detention without charge, because they hadn't even yet had an investigation into his case. And all that would happen was we'd be sending him to Hungary to be detained in a prison with no forthcoming trial. And it was quite of concern was when the judge turned around to my son's barrister and said, you know, I can't listen to your arguments, I cannot hear your arguments, because I am directed from Brussels on these matters. And that was something I never thought I'd hear in a British court. So, after a couple of appearances in the High Court, the judge said, no, you're going to have to go to Hungary. Never at any time was my son arrested or in the sense of handcuffed or even in the presence of a police officer. He accepted what the judge said. He's got a sound respect for authority, and the judge said you'll have to go to Gatwick Airport and you'll have to go to report to this desk and meet these people and go to Hungary. So my son took himself to Gatwick Airport and went along to the meeting point that was designated. At this point, several Hungarian, well, I can only call them thugs. They were wearing black t-shirts and jeans, came onto the scene, and they were in the company of a Hungarian Interpol officer who introduced themselves. And there was a television camera there filming this. They thought they'd filmed this handover as it not sort of been recorded before. And so these great thugs with their jeans and their holders turned round and went into like a rugby scrum and started to put on black balaclavas so nobody could see their faces. At which the television cameras thought this was going to be fantastic because they'd have a nice bit of news to show on the television. And with that, the whole situation became very agitated, and I would estimate at least 12, probably more, heavily armed English police officers arrived on the scene and cordoned off an area the size of probably half a football field, and made a promise that nobody could come in with it. And then further officers came in and instructed everybody, all those people going to Hungary, please leave the departure lounge and disappear. This was very distressing for my son, for his former business colleague, and it was very distressing for me. But I was assured by the Hungarian Interpol officer I wasn't to worry, because as soon as they arrived in Hungary, they would contact me, they'd have use of the telephone, because that was their right. They'd have the use of the telephone, and they'd be able to let us know where they were being held, or where they were, and that they were safe and well. So the last I saw of my son that day was when he was being hustled out of there amongst a barrage of heavily armed English police officers escorting these, what I can only refer to as Hungarian thugs, into the departure lounge, or wherever they disappeared to. And that was the last that I saw of my son for some considerable time. When Michael had arrived in Hungary, we didn't know what had happened to him, because the forthcoming phone call that we were assured didn't happen. He didn't phone in that evening. In fact, he didn't phone in the next day, and he didn't phone in the day after. So we tried to make some inquiries as to what had happened to him. And we phoned the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we phoned the consulate at the embassy in Budapest, and they said that they'd contacted the Hungarian authorities and they had no records of any English citizens being detained, and denied that they were in fact in their care or custody. So we didn't know who to turn to, because as we said, the politicians, they didn't want to know. Nobody seemed to care. We employed a Hungarian lawyer who had been working on the case whilst they were in England, and that's how we knew there'd been no investigation as yet. And he managed to track them down and find them. But the Hungarians wouldn't allow him access to them. And it was at that time the telephone rang, and I was getting desperate, not sure what to do, and on the end of the telephone was William Dartmouth. First time I'd ever heard from William at all, and offering his assistance, and that was the first bit of hope that I'd heard, and we organised things like protests outside the Hungarian embassy, and so forth, and William was very much in the front line of that. And I have to say, because the Hungarians, funny bunch, we all protested there from Corfu Castle, and we're not, we're not a bunch of stone-throwing youngsters, but they immediately called the diplomatic police. I was sort of arrested and removed, and refused. All we were doing was handing in a letter of protest, and they wouldn't take that from us either. Needless to say, there are sealed letterboxes, so you can't even push it through the letterbox. So it was William who arranged for somebody, one of the consuls, to come out and actually take the letter from us, insisting that we weren't in fact in Hungary, we were on British soil, and that our protest had a right to be heard. So thank you for that, William. Back in Budapest, things weren't going so well for my son. He was held, he'd been taken to a former KGB prison, and William's been to this prison. He knows it's 7 stories high. I have no idea how many people, there must be a lot of people in there. When William says 1 hour a day for exercise, it's interesting to note that that exercise takes place on a cage on the roof. There's no sort of courtyard where you go into. And my son only had light English clothes, and by now the Budapest winter had set in, and being on the 7th floor of a building with the wind chill factor, temperatures were down to about -25. So it was very difficult to take any external exercise at all. It was also, a little thing to note is that we think of prisons over here, and prisons are pretty tough places, I suppose they are wherever you go in the world, but some of the surprising things that happened there was that this was a racially segregated prison, and they had different floors for Romani gypsies and for foreigners, and they had a separate area for ethnic white Hungarians. I won't go too much into that, there's a political thing there. But gradually, my son was prevented from having any occupational material, neither myself or any, the embassy, nobody, his lawyer, nobody could get through to him an English-Hungarian dictionary. That was forbidden, as was a newspaper, as was any communication with the outside world. His lawyer said he was being held incommunicado, as they called it. He wasn't even allowed a visit from the Anglican priest, of which the ambassador was one of his parishioners. And prison visits were part of daily life, but he was never allowed a visit from him. It was the, again, back here in the UK, nobody really wanted to know much about this. Times were becoming desperate, but William's protests grew more and more. He ended up out in Budapest and doing the rounds with the diplomats and so on. And it was eventually, after 115 days, that my son was released. Still without charge, and still with no trial, no prosecution, anything against him. And that trial took place, or completed, just recently. And after 7 years of investigation, after 10 months at trial, they found him guilty of something he hadn't been charged with. So that's another matter. And for those that asked on the way in or wanted to know, he has lodged an appeal. So that case continues. But the process of getting there, unlike had it been here, with even back to Westminster Magistrates Court, all the courts being in London and not regionalised, trying to defend a trial which is in Budapest and not in Bournemouth, is a very expensive occupation. There is no legal aid available for it, and to date has cost us over £100,000. So, not some, and what happens to a lot of other people that didn't have the support network that my son Michael had with him, well, I don't know what happens to those people. They must become part of, I suppose, the disappeared, who just disappear and go away. I met many people on my journey coming through to here today, and I met people, as William has already pointed out, people who were the cases of mistaken identity, who'd been through the most awful processes, arrested at airports in front of their wife and children, and being taken away as convicted murderers for committing murders in countries they'd never visited or never been to. Just purely mistaken identities, and very, very traumatic that was indeed. Our politicians, and I say our politicians obviously excluding UKIP and people as brave as this, to stand up against what is certainly in Eastern Europe still a very difficult environment, and to think that our politicians have agreed a parity of systems and exposed British people to some of the goings-on of some of these countries. I think from what I've gone through, and I've been wounded by this, but I have to say I believe it's an absolute disgrace. And I just give great thanks that there are people like William and all those UKIP MPs out there in Brussels who are standing up for us and bringing this to the attention of the wider British public. So, William, I say thank you.
William and Mark are happy to take your questions for a short while, if anybody has any questions. Gentleman there. Yes.
Yeah, ask William something. I'm still not quite sure about the European Court of Human Rights. Would I be right in saying it's not actually part of the European Union? It's not conditional, you know, to be a member. We're not conditional for us to then be a member of the European Court or subscribe to it. Does that also include the European Arrest Warrant? I mean, if we withdrew from these, it wouldn't affect our membership of the European Union. Am I right there?
You're very well informed. The European Arrest Warrant applies only to countries which are members of the European Union, of which there are 26. The European Court of Human Rights is for those countries which are members of something called the Council of Europe. Now, I was given a list of the countries with no total. I totted it up as 46. But that's why there are countries like Azerbaijan in there and Moldova, all of which have judges on the European Court of Human Rights and are not members of the European Union. But there is a refinement of that, which is that you can't be a member of the European Union unless you subscribe to the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think that's another big plus. The other point which I didn't make, because I felt that there wasn't enough time, I was perhaps imposing on your goodwill, is that the European Court of Human Rights has systematically, so it was set up in 1959, has systematically expanded its jurisdiction over, for instance, immigration matters, which are really none of its concern at all.
Thank you. Rod?
You say you're going to appeal. How far are you prepared to go to clear your son's name?
Well, I have to say first of all, that's my son's decision, and my son has lodged an appeal, and he feels he stands accused of something he's not guilty of. He says he hasn't done it, and he believes that it's a political decision that they insist on finding him guilty. So he just says he will go as far as he's possibly able to.
Right, gentleman there.
Sorry, Bobby, is it just possibly just tell us what he was accused of, please?
Yeah, well, he was running a small business there, which basically collapsed in 2005, and it was alleged that the company had left creditors behind, and they turned these people into victims, or attempted to turn them into victims of fraud. And at the final count, when we were in court, the amount had been was standing at about approximately £12,000.
So we're talking about in this country, it would have been just bankruptcy then?
Oh, in this country, it would have been a civil matter about that.
Yes, I think, perhaps I can say, in this country, it would have been in the small. Basically, there was a business that failed, a small business that failed, and in this country, it would have gone to the small claims court, if at all.
Yes, the lady there.
Me?
Yes.
Hi.
Sorry, it's very difficult to see.
It's Vanessa Pan. I've been to many meetings and I've heard your case many times. As far as I understand that William has always been there for you, but I was very disappointed to see that it was Richard Drax that was in the Echo, Richard Drax that was on the TV. I do assume that you are now a UKIP member, that you're not of the Conservative ilk.
I run a pub, so I feel very careful in politics, but I will say that Richard Drax, in fairness to him, when this started, of course, he was not an MP. Since he's been an MP, he's been involved, he's been to Budapest, and in fairness to Richard Drax, he stood up on the floor of the House of Commons and paid a great tribute to William for his efforts on behalf of my son.
Is there anyone from the Bournemouth Echo here? Is anyone from the Bournemouth Echo here? I will say, first of all, I've got to say about Richard Drax, to be fair, he made a very elegant mention of me on the floor of the House of Commons. So I've got no problem with Richard Drax. But I will say, the Bournemouth Echo, as far as UKIP is concerned, is a bit like Pravda. We've been airbrushed out of history. John Baxter actually wrote a very good letter pointing out that Michael and Jason were released, not least because of my efforts. I say my efforts. I don't want to make this sound pretentious, and also publicity from the BBC as well, by the way. In February 2010. And Richard Drax wasn't elected to the House of Commons until May 2010 for the first time. But the final thing happened at this time is that we sent out a press release which included the words, which I said earlier, that this case would have come under the small claims court, if at all. And those very words were ascribed to Richard Drax in the Bournemouth Echo. But I will also say that something else about the Bournemouth Echo, which has got nothing to do with UKIP and nothing to do with me, which is that we tried very hard to get the Bournemouth Echo interested in this case way back at the end of 2009, and they weren't interested. And by the way, the series of events which resulted in Michael and Jason being freed came about. It is of moderate interest, this, because Jason McColrick's mother comes from Plymouth and lives in Plymouth, and actually it was the Plymouth paper that carried the story, and that made BBC Southwest have an entire 15-minute item on it on their local politics show, and that was the beginning of the series of events which resulted in Michael and Jason not being in prison for 3.5 years before coming to trial and before there was a verdict. But the Bournemouth Echo could be a little bit undistinguished. But we in UKIP, we just have to learn to live with it. That's the point. Never complain, never explain.
I have to agree, actually, because when I was chairman, I regularly wrote letters to the Echo, and they were very rarely published. So, Vanessa, I don't think you should be too hard on Richard Drax. I think it's definitely a problem with the Echo. But the other thing I can say, that you've just given me my YouTube moment, which is going to be about the Bournemouth Echo. Because I remember when we had a local election, and they gave a full page to the Greens. Now the Greens, in the results, they came absolutely nowhere, and we had a very good local candidate. So, you know, and it might have something to do with the fact that I think the editor of the Echo is a paid-up Conservative member.
So is the deputy editor.
Can't be sure.
William,
Any other questions?
15 letters there, I wrote to the Echo, and suddenly the letter said they don't receive any more letters regarding the EU. So that's a typical situation what it's about.
By the way, we had the same problem with the Bath Chronicle, for the record. They don't print out press releases or anything.
Never mind.
But we keep on going.
Last week they had no option but to put us in the papers all over the country, thank goodness. Right. Anybody? Next question. Yes.
I think the question
hasn't had a question.
We thank you for, because it's early, but you need to be nominating your candidates now for the next election and let them get out on the streets. You know, it's great, you know, it's no use talking about them and putting out placards at the last minute. We need to be demonstrating now. And I'm not in UKIP, I'm an independent. I'm completely independent of this.
Well, thank you very much for coming, sir. Well, I don't run the party organisation. I'd be kicked out very quickly if I thought I did. But you're absolutely right, and strenuous efforts, as I understand it, are being made to nominate candidates early and in good time.
Every meeting that I go to, I hear about exactly what you've said. It's vital that we nominate candidates now, and in fact, a training team has been set up in Bournemouth West for candidates to learn about electioneering. Right.
If I could just say
next
something
question, please.
I understand a principal proposer, sponsor for this European Arrest Warrant was one by name Graham Watson, a Liberal Democrat MEP. Has he ever been challenged or approached on this particular case? And if so, what has been his input or response to it?
Can I ask that first, Ray?
Yes, exactly.
Just a matter of interest from my point of view, as I've just mentioned my son's case, is that in the early days when this has happened, I had Mr. Watson actually phoned our public house and told me and instructed me to stop being so vocal in criticising the European Arrest Warrant, because it was necessary for the rule of your law in Europe, and it was something I clearly knew nothing about. So that was his input to me.
There's actually two debates, one on BBC Southwest, one on ITV, with me and Graham Watson, which are actually on my website. But if you want to know, he just keeps on saying, we need cooperation, this is something that happens in the 21st century, to which I point out that Britain has been members, for example, of Interpol since 1923, and we can perfectly well cooperate with police forces in other countries, as we always have done, without throwing out Magna Carta, habeus corpus, and the rest, which is the effect of this, as you've heard. But it's all on my website. But there's these two debates from my website, and they might even be on YouTube again now, I think, perhaps.
Right, next question, please. Yes, certainly.
It may be the $40,000 question, but what has got into the British psycho that people and men and women in Parliament and politicians are one of us and have actually committed themselves to the most evil federalist dictatorship? Now, those of us who lived through the last war know exactly what the Russian communist system was, and we know exactly what the Third Reich federal system was. Where have their minds gone? All one can say, supposedly, or I ask you, what is their agenda? Is it Bilderberg?
Well, I lived in the United States for 8 years of my adult life, and I have a very good expression there, which is you want to look at the donut and not the hole. And the fact of the matter is that between 45 and 55% of British people would vote to leave the EU. There will be a referendum in the next 5 years. I can absolutely solemnly predict that. And we must do whatever we can to make sure that it's 55% to vote to get out and not 45%.
May I come back on that, please? Because Cameron has said he will not leave the EU. And also, of course, he's saying we have to negotiate. Well, now, the fact is the EU have never negotiated with anybody for reduction. And so, and of course, we know Cameron, he's a slippery eel, totally unworthy. He will say, oh, we'll have an election, or we'll have the referendum, and then he will not have the questions that we want, in or out.
I think I'm a bit more optimistic. One of the political parties, and it might even be the Labour Party, will put in their manifesto to have an in or out referendum before 2015. We can have a dialogue afterwards.
Could I say that
and the others will have to follow suit.
Southwest and been thoroughly tutored on the treaties of the EU. And I wonder how many here are totally familiar with the treaties of the EU. It is the final federal state that they're after. Look, they're leaving the Greek citizens dying on the streets. They don't care a damn about them. And look at what Mark's family has had to suffer.
Absolutely.
Just anybody who hasn't had a question, first of all? No? Right.
Would you maybe go to bed with the...
Sorry, I can't hear you.
The vote on the referendum?
I didn't hear the question.
Would UKIP go to bed with the Labour Party to vote on the referendum?
It's above my pay grade. Above my pay grade.
That's definitely the question.
Well,
above my pay grade.
If they did, I wouldn't be a member
No,
of the
what I did say, and my guess is as good as yours, but one of the political parties will do that, and then the other ones will have to follow suit. So you'll see that all three political parties will go in having a referendum in 2015. And then the best thing that we can do is to do everything we can to ensure that we come first in 2014 in the European elections, which we're well on track to do, and to continue to do well in the by-elections. And many thanks to Diana Butler here in the pool as well. It's not just national elections.
Yes.
It's not just parliamentary elections, but not just parliamentary by-elections. Too small, I hope it's legible, saying that I'm a member of the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament. Now, the International Trade Committee, apart from being quite important, because as you probably know, but most people don't, since 1975, all Britain's trade agreements are made by the EU Trade Commissioner. And one of the effects of the ghastly Lisbon Treaty meant that the trade agreements have to go through. I'm getting to my point. All the European Parliament has co-decision making. They all have to go through the European Parliament. But in addition, the Trade Committee is very finely balanced. About between a quarter and a third of all the votes are either tied or passed between 2 or 3 votes. Now, that is the only European Parliamentary Committee where that is the case as far as the UK Independence Party is concerned. Virtually all the committees, the votes are normally 35 to 1, 32 to 1 with 3 abstentions, 28 to 1, 28 to 1 with 5 abstentions, and so on. Now, I go to this committee because my vote matters. I also lead for the group on the committee. For Nigel to spend his time sitting in the Fisheries Committee, it makes absolutely no difference at all. Well, and that is the thing. So, and you have to be on certain. You have to be on certain committees. And the fact of the matter is that Nigel Farage is not a popular figure in the Parliament, as none of us are, because we're telling the truth. And that is why they're dredging up. When I was at school, when I was at university, it used to be called debating points. But that's the background to it.
I've seen the video and it's really stupid. It's Guy Verhofstadt, who's the ex-Dutch Prime Minister, I think, who really does hate Nigel. And actually it's quite a compliment that he's saying that Nigel is doing nothing for the European Union. I think that's a sign of his success.
I would like to thank William and Mark for all that they have told us tonight. It's been very, very interesting, but not very happy. Mark, may I wish you and your family all the best in your Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.